and please join me in welcoming Marco. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ruby. It's great to be here. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me back. I enjoyed our conversation last year, and then I was aspirational in my perspective. This year, I want to be a bit more practical, still future-focused, but perhaps more narrowly. The practical future window that I'm going to focus on today is about 2 years, from now until the next national call for proposals from IRCC in 2024. So we're still looking at what our sector can aspire to, but more practically. So I'm going to start with where we're at as a sector, give a current snapshot, and then focus on IRCC's vision for digital services, our sector vision for digital services, some of the challenges we continue to have, which is unlikely to be too many surprises here for you. And then I'd like to end with a focus on you, in particular, what more we can learn from your years of experience to help the sector. So our window for the aspirational vision from last year is, I would say, about 7 years, 2 calls from proposals from now. So possibly earlier in terms of pilot projects that might happen, but the vision will hopefully start to be in place in 2029. And that seems far away, but it'll get here sooner than we think. So on to the practical, starting with what we know, a current snapshot with a short history lesson, as well as some challenges we know we face. So where are we at? IRCC's call for proposals, as I mentioned, is coming in 2024. We've learned a lot over the past 2 years, as well as in previous decades. Current research on technology and innovation is very much aligned with similar themes, findings, and recommendations from the past. Agencies across the country are at various stages of reopening and evaluating their service delivery models. So I'm going to start with a bit of a pre-pandemic history of technology in the sector and where it intersects with current research. I'll share some good ideas in the sector and digital transformation that predate as well as have emerged during the pandemic, and provide an overview about what we've learned about our sector during the pandemic and what that means for our future. So there's a lot of research. In fact, well over 20 years of research in our sector that focuses on technology and innovation. A number of common themes come up consistently. There are unique needs and challenges for different regions, just as there are unique needs and challenges for different communities and different client groups. The sector has always been keen to work together to build more innovative and collaborative practices. And during the pandemic, we saw dialogue across the sector, but also with funders leading to innovation. And we should build on this moment of trust, collaboration, and coordination. We understand that we need to be investing time and resources into building capacity in the sector, and that has been researched and recommended for years. The entire settlement sector is keen on expanding service eligibility to formally serve clients such as temporary foreign workers, international students, and technology can really help us play a role there. We need to continue to build and implement different funding arrangements that are innovation focused, that allow for both testing and experimenting and learning from those and building and pivoting. And we know, and we've heard time and time again, that we need investment in knowledge mobilization so that we're sharing what's being learned, that we're understanding what's working in the sector. So if someone is working on something interesting, others find out about it, either to leverage it, bring it into their own work, or even replicate it. Newcomers, we've also learned and have studied for a while that newcomers have always driven their own settlement journey, creating community, supports, and even services for each other. We know that not all newcomers access services, and it's important that we not only encourage newcomer innovation, but understand it as much as possible so we can support them in their practices, but also help with interventions that might make a difference or even shorten their settlement journey. So none of these trends are new. They come up time and time again in sector research, and they came up again in recent research from the Settlement Sector and Technology Task Group report, the Settlement 2.0 and 3.0 reports from Peace Geeks, to digital inclusion of refugees resettling to Canada, the Opportunities and Barriers reports, which may be particularly of interest here because it focused on the Canadian Orientation Abroad program, and AMSA and ARCC's report on client management systems, all the way to the recent Association of Canadian Studies report envisioning the future of the immigrant-serving sector. So we've been trying to figure out new and innovative ways to provide information for some time. Before there was formal pre-arrival, we were all doing pre-arrival work. So settlement.org was created in 2000. COSTI started offering online services in 2004, ISANS in 2007. And everyone here at this conference is a sector leader in online service delivery, which predates the pandemic. So we've been running webinars, we've created useful orientation videos, we've been using digital messaging and smartphones with clients for years. And if you're thinking about creating digital literacy resources for your newcomers, consider not duplicating efforts, but build on things like these that already exist. So these are 4 digital literacy for newcomer resources and projects that all predate the pandemic. This is not a new conversation, nor a new area of development in our sector. And we should be building and sharing on each other, sharing and building on each other's work, sharing it back to the sector for all to use and to improve on. During the pandemic, all of these digital literacy style resources have continued to be built upon, but usually in silos by individual agencies, in some cases out in the public sphere where some actively share their content and innovation. There are many examples of resources the sector has created that you've created within your own organizations, but we need to share them so we can all use them, build on them, improve them, and share them with newcomers and with each other. So this is just a snapshot of a few areas where our sector has been working on technology around assessment and data. These are intake, assessment, and tracking systems that are trying to create innovation in our intake and needs assessment processes and data management. And all of these sites and technologies predate the pandemic. There are other interesting examples. So here we have examples of automation with online support. The Orientation to Ontario chatbot that Costi built with its partners, Access Employment's virtual employment and resource attendant. And we also have chat lines like the online newcomer mental health support chat at the Niagara Folk Arts Centre, where newcomers can interact with actual staff in multiple languages. Agencies have also been busily creating their own apps, whether it's from the Arrival Advisor app serving British Columbia and Manitoba, the Welcome to Alberta app, which was replicated in Saskatchewan, Costi's Arrive On app that builds on the Orientation to Ontario content, or even agency-specific apps like Point B from the YMCA in Hamilton and Brantford, or the Mennonite New Life Centre of Toronto app. Now, it's important to note that work on almost all these innovations predated the pandemic. It's also important to note that the downloads for most apps, at least in the Google Play Store, which does show downloads, are quite low, which to me suggests that perhaps apps are not necessarily the way to go on their own, but as I outlined last year, should be considered within a suite of digital services, all connected to the same content, providing a no wrong door approach to technology. We need to think about what the possibilities of service delivery could be if we combine so many different silos together. How could it be a better experience for newcomers? In our context, we've called it in the past a no wrong door approach. Tech calls it an omni-channel strategy, which is perhaps simply a technical innovation of an approach that we've aspired to create for decades in our sector, in our community, and in other social and community service sectors as well. This omni-channel approach means integrating all service approaches into one seamless method of communication and engagement with newcomers. Newcomers choose how they want to interact and get information, so a no digital wrong door. And that could mean having an app, but that information is accessible in a web format, accessible through digital messaging. The idea being that they wouldn't have to download the app in order to get the information, but they could choose the channel where they get it from. So what are some of the specific things we learned about our sector during the pandemic? Service providers, even those that didn't see digital as a legitimate service delivery method or channel, were able to adjust quickly to a digital and remote service delivery model. These following slides are from a fall 2020 IRCC sector survey that sought to understand the impact of the pivot to online service delivery in order to better support service providers in this new context to inform future policy and programming. So not surprisingly, we've learned that online services are possible, even desirable for some newcomers and for many services. Most service providers indicate, yes, they'll continue delivering some online services with some changes. And those changes are going to be moving from a completely digital and remote service delivery model during the pandemic to a hybrid or a blended model. And that's really simply a fact at this point. It does mean some fundamental shifts in how we work and what our jobs will look like moving forward, but it's going to be happening. So what did online service delivery look like during the pandemic? As expected, online staff-led and phone, broken into call, text, and email, are the highest. So it's not the self-directed resources, but the staff mediated resources. Now, I would have loved to have seen the call, text, email split into their own categories because I think that it would be interesting to see the differences. We know, for example, that phone calls took longer and were more resource intensive than other technologies, but were also incredibly important as a tool to reach newcomers who were either not using or didn't want to use technology to access services, which leads us to our next slide. We've learned a lot about how technology can work and for whom in our sector. The digital divide has raised issues about digital inclusion for us that we haven't really faced directly before as a sector. But dealing with these challenges has become a priority for our sector, and I think that's a really good thing. Also worth looking at what we know about newcomer technology use in Canada. So here's some recent data from the Media Technology Monitor survey of newcomers in 2021. When it comes to digital, newcomers are mobile first. That's really not a surprise. How they use digital platforms is useful for us to understand as well. Social networks, messaging apps are popular and are used not just for messaging, but as multimedia communications tools. So is this new information? It actually isn't, but it is useful to see that this is a trend that has been studied over time. So let me take you back a little bit. So in 2007, Statistics Canada told us that recent newcomers were using the internet more than the Canadian born. In 2014, Yahoo Canada's digital acculturation study told us when it comes to media preferences, new Canadians are digital first with a particular focus on mobile devices. Sounds familiar, right? This was reconfirmed in 2017 by a Université du Québec à Montréal study and continues to be confirmed by our own experiences in recent research. So in 2020, a Toronto South LIP study looked at newcomer device and internet access in Toronto during the pandemic. Again, newcomers are mobile first, but they also started diving into some of the digital divide challenges facing newcomers, which we've all come to know and understand, as I mentioned earlier. There's other specific research over the last few years that has been looking not just at what newcomers use in terms of devices, the internet, and social media, but how and why. So for example, Syrian youth using social media to share information about Canada with other Syrians, while also sharing information about Syria for Canadians. How Chinese immigrants use social media and how that influences their acculturation and their settlement experiences. The role that ethnic community social media forums play in Bangladeshi newcomer settlement into Canadian society. The use of social media tools for building professional networks during the pandemic. All of this is recent and all of it points to a number of similar outcomes. And the reality is that we know that newcomers search for better or different experiences and that newcomer networks have always existed outside of our formal service ecosystem. They've also increasingly been digital, and this has only gotten stronger over time. So the sites on the top left have existed for literally decades, since settlement.org or before in 2000. Most of these websites are in English, but there are many more in other languages. They house discussion areas in the hundreds of thousands of participants. Many of you know these sites, may have used them in your own immigration experience. They are resources in the newcomer settlement journey. We already know that a relatively small percentage of newcomers access mainstream in-person government and community services. This is well documented in the research. Newer online social networking and information sites, such as those in the top right, mean that they're potentially bypassing these formal and mainstream services even more. Online groups and digital messaging apps and channels in the bottom right mean that the conversations are increasingly private and hidden from us. So what's the service provider role in providing services on these sites or in these channels? Or at the very least, looking at them as rich outreach opportunities. This is something that's been fairly consistently overlooked and a missed opportunity for our sector and for newcomers on their settlement journey because they could benefit from your knowledge and guidance. And we need to learn from newcomers directly and meet them where they are in these spaces. At the same time, the networks have become increasingly private. Newcomers are also increasingly very public, sharing their experiences and stories. Just as they've migrated to new channels, platforms, and apps, and even built their own, newcomers are sharing their experiences with each other, and their reach can be viral. So look at the views for some of these YouTube videos. 1.3 million views, 203,000 views. What might a connection with these influencers, these newcomer influencers, look like for our organizations? How can their reach and influence support your work? So let's just look at one example in some depth. This channel had 203,000 views of their Moving to Canada video on the previous slide. Their channel has 103,000 subscribers. Their first day in Canada video has over 1 million views. And she's been recently documenting her house buying experience. And you can see some of those videos on the second row, tens of thousands of views per video. And note the length of most of these videos. Most, including her most watched, are over 10 minutes long. People will watch compelling content that is useful for them in their own settlement journey. So her About page has a simple invitation for collaboration. Some of you may be spending money on social media advertising, etc. Well, what might a collaboration with Pooja and other popular influencers in the digital space mean for you in terms of a return on investment and reach? As well, these videos are on YouTube, ready for you to embed into your own content. You can literally make use of this content now in your work. So these videos, these stories, these experiences can be part of your own content, what you share with newcomers, whether you create relationships with the creators of this content or not. If they're useful to newcomers, which clearly from some of those viewership statistics, they can be useful for you to reshare, but also add your own context around to build on and create something new with. So for example, if you provide the series, Pooja's series of how to buy the house buying experience, surrounded with information about some of the technical details, PDFs from Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, additional orientation guides that you might have about renting and buying houses. You can use those videos as part of that. So that's a long overview of the current snapshot of where we're at, but it's where we are today. So I want to move on to IRCC's vision. And we know that IRCC is on board with the digital transformation process. Their expressed vision aligns with the research, sector experience, and the recent recommendations in particular that have been made to them. And that's a lot of progress for us. So as you see here, IRCC has expressed a vision for clients, service providing organizations or SPOs, and themselves. So clients are going to have access to hybrid service options. Service providers will continue their digital transformation, but focused in a hybrid service delivery format, right? That no wrong door approach. An IRCC settlement program is going to identify a suite of digital settlement services that are effective and efficient. And we need to help them define that. And we also hope that this includes not just settlement programs, but language and other IRCC programs as well, because it's important for us to have consistency across the sector as we build out a sector technology vision. Over the next 2 years, they've committed to continuing to build an evidence base of what works. So learning from your experiences, learning from some of the SDI or the service delivery improvement projects, and learning in general from some of the digital experiments and programs that we've identified in the space. And they're going to they've identified specific areas where the sector has been asking for guidance in these reports, in public forums. So that's cybersecurity, privacy, digital literacy, and they're going to help build out digital guidelines and standards that will become part of the next call for proposals in 2024. So we know practically that this is coming, that we can build towards this guidance, but it's also going to be coming from IRCC. And as part of that decision-making process, they've committed to creating a technology task group that will guide the sector and collaborate with IRCC to make this vision practical as well as fundable. So again, the next big call for proposals is in 2 years. And we'll know then what direction the Digital Settlement Agency is heading in and who will lead in the sector. So the sector vision, it's happening now. So this technology task group has become a national steering committee on technology that is currently being created and will guide the sector and collaborate with IRCC to make their vision and the sector's broader vision practical and fundable, right? We also need to look at where other funders, such as provinces, United Way, philanthropy groups, foundations, where they're at with digital and push them along this digital continuum of seamless service delivery. So you all receive funding from all these different groups, government, United Way, corporations, foundations. What's their vision for digital service delivery, and how can you work with them, influence it, and make sure it works for you, but is also aligned with the broader sector vision for digital transformation? So what are the components I think we need to achieve the sector vision? When we're looking at the immediate future of settlement work, the next 2 years, I like to think about it as a bit of an iceberg. There's a great deal below the surface that has to be in place before what we see above the surface is effective. And as you'll see, what's below the surface isn't just about building digital competencies, it's much broader than that. The future of settlement work is about much more than technology. But I want to focus this iceberg conversation on technology since that's what we're focused on here. And these are some of the baselines we need to focus on. I'm going to review settlement worker competencies, community change models that focus on community innovation, then what the Digital Settlement Agency is, what digital skills you'll need to be working on, and when we jump above the iceberg to visible uses of technology and where IRCC's future vision floats with that iceberg. So the future of your job, in particular the frontline worker's job, comes up a lot in this conversation, mainly as a point of anxiety, a fear of being replaced by technology. And I don't think your job is at risk. It's evolving, but you are more important than ever before. And as we look to the future, we can and should drive the change that is happening and ensure that it aligns with our sector's core values as well as the type of work we want to be doing. So we've been talking about frontline competencies as a sector for many, many years. In 2019, some folks did some interesting research and looked at the big picture competencies of settlement practitioners. The report found that the work of settlement counselors goes well beyond just providing direct services to newcomers to also include building capacity in communities that welcome newcomers. The role of settlement counselors has two fundamental parts, each based on capacity building. So it's empowering newcomers, but also empowering destination communities or creating welcoming and inclusive communities. So this emerging aspect of the role of settlement counselors is focused on this capacity building in your existing communities to become inclusive of newcomers. And this involves advocating to overcome biases and systemic barriers that prevent newcomers from participating in society and creating more inclusive environments. The report itself proposes 8 critical competencies that you see on the screen to help settlement practitioners be successful. And as we'll see as we move through the iceberg, these skills provide the foundation for a digital literacy and competency framework. So Tamarack's community change model shows us that community innovation is just one part of the puzzle. I covered this in some depth last year, but I want to just add it to the iceberg because it's about systems thinking, new forms of leadership, engaging our communities or newcomers in our systems change, identifying and amplifying what works, right? That knowledge mobilization and knowledge sharing, and building on it to create new approaches. So building on what our experiences, building on what's working, building on what we know. And we're moving ambitiously towards creating a digitally mature sector. So this image, it comes from NetHope, an organization that supports international humanitarian organizations in their digital transformation journey. And they've created a model for the digital nonprofit that looks at 6 core digital competency areas: people, processes, technology, data, investment, and readiness. Now, the Canadian Centre for Nonprofit Digital Resilience, which is emerging and which some organizations in our sector have been part of the consultations for, is a useful emerging national organization that can help ensure consistency across the entire Canadian nonprofit sector when it comes to digital transformation. Now, they're using the NetHope model and have identified additional conditions and baselines needed to make a digitally mature sector or a digitally resilient nonprofit sector happen. Now, you'll see, as you look at the slide, some common themes from our sector's research and advocacy: knowledge mobilization, professional development at all levels, from leadership on down to workers, roadmaps to get us there, shared technology, that seamless service platforms that I mentioned last year, so we're sharing and using the technology together, better data practices, which practically means better understanding of newcomers, their journeys, their technology and information practices, as well as investment. All of this is relevant and is useful to us. So they've also identified 9 key strategic areas of focus. And once again, they overlap with our own and what's come out of the research for decades, but in particular, the recent research done in our sector on technology and innovation. So it's useful for us to be connected with this emerging national organization and their activities, because while IRCC is our sector's largest funder, once again, our sector is broader in scope as well as funding jurisdiction. So it's useful for us to be part of this broader advocacy effort, this broader baselining effort, as well as the policy structures and discussions that emerge. Now, I've created a draft version of the NetHope model applied to our sector. So this is sort of a half-baked idea, and it's something that's emerging. But if we look at their categories, in our context, some specifics emerge where we are and should be focusing. We can start to see what our priorities might be. So at the core, at the center, is the newcomer or newcomer-centric data, that creating a seamless newcomer settlement experience journey. We need to be centering newcomers, whether they access our services or not, right? Not just clients, but newcomers. We need to center them in our plans. And when we think about people in our sector, we're talking about professional development in our context, building a competencies framework for our work, including knowledge mobilization and transfer. When we're looking at processes, we're talking about digital and data maturity, as well as risk frameworks. So these are cybersecurity, privacy, encryption frameworks. Frameworks we can not only build on, but borrow from, customize, and implement in our sector. Technology, in our case, needs to be tempered with digital inclusion and equity, right? What we've learned about the digital divide and the digital realities, not only in our sector, but among newcomers. And this needs to align with our sector's values of access, anti-oppression, and inclusion. When we're thinking about readiness, this is where we're talking about those baselines in hybrid service delivery, where we have a common minimum standard or floor of infrastructure and skills and competencies that no agency and no individual should fall below. We can certainly exceed those baselines, and we should strive to, but at their core, we all should have access to build those baselines in the sector. So no matter where you go in the sector, every agency, every worker has a certain core set of competencies. Now, when it comes to investment, I like to use what Alan Broadbent from the Maitrey Foundation called the 3 I's of immigrant integration: intentionality, instruments, and investments. So we need to be strategic. We need to be intentional about what we're doing. We need to have the right instruments, tactics, or technologies in order to address what we're being intentional about. And we need investments in those instruments and in that strategy in order to make it happen. And once again, data is key to all of that. So in this model, once again, I put at the center the newcomer. And it's really about the entire system and our entire service delivery model being newcomer centric, fully understanding newcomers and communities in order to create that seamless newcomer settlement journey. Understanding newcomers makes the technology and service intervention decisions much easier. If we understand them, we know what the right way to serve them using technology will be. So once again, the Canadian Centre for Nonprofit Digital Resilience's working principles are very aligned with our sector vision. Strategically, it makes sense for us to participate in their work, and it's useful for us to know that there are others doing similar work, allies, if you will, who we can work with to create larger visions across the country, borrow strategies and practices from, and share with, and work to build a nonprofit sector-wide digital maturity model. So what does that mean for individual workers at service providers? So NetHope's digital skills framework is an organized way to guide you about what to know, learn, and do in order to better communicate, collaborate, solve complex problems, advocate, and create new ways of working in an increasingly digital world. So this is their digital skills framework. It's an evolving framework as newer technology and trends such as the advancements in cloud technology, blockchain, AI and machine learning, as well as Internet of Things and future technologies will need to be incorporated into the framework to fully identify the skills needed for employees and organizations to be successful now and in the future. So technical literacy forms the foundation for all other skills in the framework, right? And that involves learning about the tools and technologies you need to succeed to make a greater impact in digital service delivery and becoming competent and proficient in them, becoming power users of your technology. Highly adaptive collaboration means that people within the organization need to participate in teams, digital teams, share projects, tasks, calendars, tools, and media. They need to work effectively across the cultural, social, and language barriers while learning to share openly across the organization, but across the sector and networks as well. Complex problem solving is the backbone of all of this. Technology allows us to use data to figure out answers to problems. It also means problems get more complicated when we get an increase in information. So we need to be able to solve increasingly complex problems using research, analytics, rapid prototyping of solutions, getting feedback, evaluating, and being able to pivot to incorporate changes and building an agile environment to achieve the best solution. So being nimble on our feet and learning as we go, and having the structures for that to be possible in as well within our organizations as well as within our funding structures. So digital responsibility is that framework of safety and security when we're online, right? In our work, we work with vulnerable populations, which means safety and security is a moral imperative, right? We and newcomers need to be able to identify secure sites as well as the benefits and risks of giving information across devices and different channels and software. When is it okay to share personal information and how? And what are our plans, plan B, C, and D for those kinds of things where we can get that information from clients in a safe and secure way? Creativity and innovation includes the ability to generate new ideas or iterate original ones with new thinking and creating new ways of doing things, right? So again, data and information and understanding newcomers can help us to form better decisions, but also allow us to participate across the organization and across the sector to generate new ideas and have new input. And the final one is entrepreneurial spirit, which is increasingly an important part of the digital skill set. It's that notion of that agile, being nimble, right? It involves an experimentation, evaluation, learning, and change attitude, as well as a feeling of ownership in what you're doing. So you can look at the way you've been doing things with new eyes, challenge the old ways of working, create with your newcomers, with clients, and with your organization and with your peers. And Eskills is a national digital literacy project for newcomers that provides a deeper dive into these areas of technical literacy and digital responsibility. While it was created for newcomers, the model is useful for us as workers as well. And their model expands on the notion of digital literacy to encompass larger and comprehensive ideas of digital fluency, digital citizenship, and digital equity. Right? So moving from digital literacy of understanding how to use the tools to digital fluency to create the ability to create something new with those tools. It's kind of like the difference between being able to read, speak, and listen in a language to being able to create a story, a poem, or a play in that language, for example. So there are these elements in the eSkills model. It's an aspirational model, but it's achievable, and it's a model that is being rolled out and taught to some newcomers, and something that our organizations should also be striving for. Now, privacy and security has come up as a concern, and it's on both the sector and IRCC's radar, as I mentioned in IRCC's vision, as something we need to resolve across the sector. For now, we need to build our competencies, both as individuals and organizations, and decision frameworks like the one on the screen here are useful, but simple steps are also our friends here, right? The basics, you hear them all the time, but we don't always do them. Use strong passwords or passphrases for your accounts. Use a password manager so you have different passwords and passphrases for all your accounts. Turn on two-factor authentication. Don't wait to download the latest security updates for your computer or your apps or your smartphones. Be skeptical. Beware of phishing and misinformation. Establish and find trusted sources and share from them. Protect your digital and other chats using secure and encrypted apps or tools for messaging. Frameworks like these can give us checklists, questions to ask ourselves about making a decision about a technology. How am I going to use it? How safe does it need to be? As well as pathways to ensure that our technology decisions are responsible, safe, and secure for newcomers and for us. So in your work, you're increasingly playing a key role in digital systems navigation as something called a digital navigator. Like general settlement work, as a digital navigator, you're helping newcomers navigate the digital system. These supports can range from providing access to hardware. Many agencies have created technology lending libraries to helping with connectivity, so better bandwidth or better internet connections. But most directly, it's the last two. It's helping newcomers become digitally literate and building your own capacity to provide digital services, including to those who may have lower technical capacity. So when you emerge above the surface of the iceberg, we start to see the visible uses of technology in our sector. And I've organized these into three areas: sector-focused, newcomer-focused, and community-focused. Sector-focused, again, means looking at how we collaborate, share knowledge, and are active in our communities of practice. So that's information sharing, collaboration, knowledge mobilization, and professional development. All of those take time, but everyone needs to focus on this approach to innovation, and we can do better as a sector to do all of these things. Being newcomer-focused means being newcomer-centric in our work. We tend to focus on what works for us and what our funding guidelines are, but we don't necessarily evaluate the newcomer journey, their experience in settlement, our place in their journey, and where we might be able to insert ourselves to have greater impact. And we know that the immigration journey, information, and system navigation is overwhelming for newcomers. Newcomers may not know what they don't know. And we know that earlier interventions can make a difference in someone's successful settlement and integration. And that's why, for example, pre-arrival services exist. If we don't reach people with timely information, there are missed opportunities, potentially longer timelines for settlement, and frustration and misinformation. So what we need to start talking about is what I mentioned earlier, is about how our entire system needs to put newcomers at the center and build out from there, right? We need to collaborate together to build better service experiences and therefore better settlement and inclusion experiences for newcomers. Community focus takes us back to that Tamarack model of community change and community innovation, where we're working together on collective impact, harnessing the knowledge and experience as well as needs of the communities that we serve. And there's a common theme through all three of these areas, sector, newcomer, and community, that comes from a Canadian consultant named Harold Jarkey, who works with individuals, organizations, and governments to improve collaboration. And he's created a seek, sense, and share model. So if you use this in your work, it can be incredibly useful to understand how you're moving along the continuum of digital navigation, systems navigation, information navigation. Seeking is finding things and keeping up to date. Building a network of colleagues or a community of practice is helpful. You have that in the pre-arrival portal for each other. It allows you to share information, to pull information from others, but also to have it pushed to us by trusted resources. Good curators in these spaces are very valuable members of a knowledge network. Sensing is how you take that information, personalize it, and use it. So this includes reflection and putting into practice what you've learned. It might require experimentation with the information you get. A lot of people learn best by doing, but it also means sense making for newcomers, helping them navigate systems around them, whether they're community systems or digital systems. And then sharing includes exchanging resources, ideas, and experiences with our networks, as well as collaborating with our colleagues. So we seek, we make sense of, and we share that information in a meaningful way with each other. But it also means how we share information with newcomers to help them on their settlement journey. So IRCC's future vision sits above and below the surface, because we know a little bit about it and hear about it in some settings, like what I've shared today, but it's not completely transparent or known to everyone in the sector. In particular, we don't know all the details. We don't know how it's going to work out, but we know that IRCC is on board when it comes to this future vision of the sector. And as we ponder all of this, the question for us is, what do we need to feel competent and comfortable to provide digital services to newcomers? Which brings us to our challenges. When we're looking at the current reality and things to work on over the next couple of years and beyond, there are a few things that come to mind for me. I'm sure there are many for you as well. We can do better at sharing and learning from each other. As individuals and organizations, we also need to be looking at wellness as a priority in our work, including ensuring that work-life boundaries and building in time for reflection and learning during digital service delivery. Remote work policies are being built by many organizations, typically individually, but we should be sharing what we're working on to build sector policies that can be personalized within organizations. Once again, that notion of baselines, right? But those with resources to build these policies and frameworks, typically those with HR departments and larger administration, can share them with others in the sector. We should be having this conversation publicly and broadly. Another challenge is expanding service eligibility and IRCC services. It's a long-standing conversation and a challenge, but as we increasingly see pathways to permanence from temporary immigration statuses, it makes sense to start figuring out how to serve, inform, and orient those newcomers who want to move along those pathways sooner in their journey rather than later. And through all of this, we're embracing digital transformation in our organizations, which means organizational and sectoral cultural change. And that's not easy, but if the pandemic has shown us anything, it's that we can do anything. The final challenges affects everything from aspirational to practical. It's the inevitable post-pandemic budget crunch, the great belt tightening, and it will come at the federal level, and we need to be ready for it. We need to be able to make the case, provide the evidence, build the business case to show IRCC and other funders why more investment is the way to go and not less. And to build this long-term vision of hybrid service delivery, digital transformation, centering and serving newcomers, clients or not, it will require the investment part of those three I's. And we need to invest, not ignore our intentions. Now, IRCC's vision and the sector's vision are working to provide this kind of evidence, but we all need to be on board to make sure that we are showing the case, we're making the case for these investments. Now, I don't want to end with challenges, but by highlighting why we all should be paying attention to you and what we can learn from you in pre-arrival services. So in 2017, I interviewed Madison Watson for my podcast, Technology and Human Services. At the time, she was Director of Pre-Arrival Settlement Services at the YMCA of the National Capital Region, so for Build On. And I always appreciated how frank she was in our conversation. It was an amazing treasure trove of information. And at the time, she and her team were working to figure out what an online service can be, how to manage online workers, and what the experience of constant change in technology would look like in the organization. And that sounds very familiar from us after the last 2 years. It was an incredibly enlightening conversation. And one of the key takeaways for me in our conversation was, if you take a key message away from it, it is to be prepared to adapt. Where you start may not be where you end up in terms of online service provision. Being flexible and open to change is important. And she may not have known just how accurate that was, but now after 2 years of pandemic service delivery, we know just how right she is. My experience during the settlement sector and technology task group and in other conversations is that service providers making the pivot to digital and remote work didn't always take advantage of the years of experience pre-arrival service providers could bring to the table. In fact, one organizational executive director I spoke with talked about how they defaulted to their ESL and link providers in their org because they had some blended service experience, and they didn't even bring in their pre-arrival team at all. So can you imagine having a team that had for at least 3 years been working fully digitally, fully online, and ignoring their experience and expertise? It was astounding to hear that. We have much work to do, and part of that is to value everyone's contribution, experience, and knowledge more actively as we build this future vision of our sector, as we build this case for investment. So my call to action for you is to share more about what you're doing, what you've learned by working online, share your current struggles, how you're working on them, work with the National Steering Committee on Technology to ensure that we all learn from how you've adapted over, not just during the pandemic, but well before it. Let's build that evidence base to show IRCC and other funders why more investment is the way to go, not less. Talk about where you started. Talk about where you're going with online service provision. We have so much to learn from each other, so let's make sure that we do. So thank you for having me today. I want to end there, and I really look forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much, Marco. That was extremely insightful. And I thought this was particularly relevant at this time because due to the nature of pre-arrival, we have heavily relied on technology, but it's interesting to think about how other SBOs have been incorporating it and moving more towards a hybrid approach as well, and the challenges that come with that, having to align those with each other, as well as all the constant changes happening around the world.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there's a ton that we can learn from pre-arrival service providers' experiences as we move forward, in particular in the next 2 years, but certainly in the next 7 as well.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so now it's time for the Q&A. And before we begin, I'd like to go over some brief reminders again. If you have a question, you can still ask through Slido, or you can also vote for other questions that you will see, and those will shoot to the top and be answered first. And we may go over a little bit to accommodate some questions, but due to time limitations, we may not have time to answer all of them. So I will just share my screen and we'll get to the questions. Okay. So the first one we have is partnerships with applications and influencers are an interesting new outreach approach, but how can we address misinformation from some of these outlets as specialists?
It's a great question. And that's one of the reasons why you want to create those partnerships, I would say, is in some ways to bring your authoritative information to them, to be part of the channel of information, right? So whether this is happening in public through a YouTube channel, through ethnic media or social media, or in some of those private spaces like WhatsApp groups or Facebook groups that you may not even have access to, being a sounding board for people who are in those groups, but actively reaching out to those influencers as specialists, as authoritative sources of information is one way to do that. I would also look, there's some interesting projects in the sector, in particular around COVID misinformation, but we know there's a lot of immigration information. So groups like Refugee-613, they're currently running a webinar series. They just had their first this week, and there's 2 more coming. And I can share that with the organizers after, around looking at dealing with misinformation around COVID and around health information. So being present and being active in those spaces is one way to deal with that. And one of my favorite examples is from one of those decades old bulletin boards. There's a website called CanadianDesi.com, which is a website focused on the South Asian community. And when you go into it, there isn't a huge presence of settlement organizations. But when I used to go into it when I worked at settlement.org, we would see, for example, real estate agents and mortgage brokers and bankers, and they're asking and answering questions. They're there with a presence, helping people understand from their perspective, leading them to authoritative information, for example. So it's important for exactly some of those reasons to give good information, because that can help shorten someone's timelines. It can help them make the right decision instead of going down the wrong path, for example, in their settlement. So I would say that that's actually a really good point, that's one of the reasons why making those connections can be quite useful to address misinformation.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there any considerations when it comes to remote work for settlement workers providing online services as part of the digitalization efforts? Thanks.
That's a broad question, and I would say a lot of what I spoke about today, from the skills competencies to the organizational considerations around remote work, building policies that are clear, that are fair to workers, for example, in terms of their preferences, in terms of how they've been serving clients. So, for example, we've learned a lot during the pandemic about the outside of regular office hours kinds of service, which has been useful flexibility both for workers but also for newcomers. So, perhaps a worker has a number of different, life constraints, family constraints, and newcomers also may be working during the day, can't access services during 9 to 5. So all of a sudden being able to make part of their work in the evening or on the weekend, obviously still within their working hours in terms of a totality, meant more flexibility for both the worker as well as for the newcomer, and more accessibility of those services. So a lot of the considerations of remote work need to be a conversation, I would say, between workers, newcomers, and management as well, so that we recognize that remote work has worked in a lot of cases, and that the workplace shouldn't be about bums in chairs, but should be about a place where we come together to socialize, to consult with each other, to have those physical interactions. But the work can be done remotely with clients for whom they want to access that work remotely. So remote work also needs to be put in the context of what is your client-based preference for in-person versus remote work. You will have some clients who want to see you in person, so you will have to be in the office from time to time. But is there also the possibility of remote work within settlement? And again, this isn't new, right? We've had settlement workers in schools, settlement workers in libraries, in remote spaces in the past where they've been doing that work. So the work doesn't have to happen in an office. The work can happen in the community. And now the community is digital, right? So that means that we can be doing it from anywhere, as long as we're, some other considerations obviously are security and privacy and confidentiality. So you're not going to meet in a coffee shop and have a counseling session with someone, in the same way that if you're working from home, you need to make sure that your connection is secure. Perhaps you're using a VPN to connect to the internet. You have to make sure that the newcomer is in a space where if you're having an in-depth personal conversation, they're not on a phone, on a bus, having a video call without headphones, talking about, domestic violence issues. So their safety, their location also matters. So there are a lot of considerations, but we've learned about this over time, and we've learned how to address them. And there are good models and frameworks from other sectors, such as virtual care, e-health, social work, that help us to understand those, as well as to achieve a certain baseline, if you will, in competency. So that's a broad question, but there are a lot of considerations that come into mind, which is why I think we need to be sharing the remote work policies that are being developed in our agencies, as well as look to other sectors, so that we can make sure that all of those considerations are met, and that every interaction is safe, accessible, and effective.
Yeah, once again, collaboration is the key word.
Yes, absolutely.
The next one is, does a no wrong door approach conflict with the idea we should be more cost efficient, not invest in an app, but something else that works better, for example?
I don't think that it conflicts with the idea of cost efficient. I think, again, investment initially in some of these things is going to go up, and then it might plateau out. We are experimenting, so I see those apps as experiments, and we need to evaluate them and learn, are newcomers downloading apps and getting service information from them, or do they just want a mobile-friendly service that they can access online? Do they need something they can download to their phone and access offline because their data plans are low, they don't have access to bandwidth, right? And that's where an app can be very useful. But in the ecosystem, and I talked about this a lot last year, was that notion of that seamless content sharing repository, right? So as we build that out, we become more efficient, perhaps because we don't have 500 articles about how to write a resume anymore. We've co-created something that the entire sector can use and then extract and pull into their app, or pull onto their portal, or send out through digital messaging, and add the last 20% of local information, right? So here's how you get your health card, and that information is standard across Ontario. The only thing that's unique is the local community health or public health or Service Ontario office, and that's where you could add the value add. But we work to become actually more efficient and over time. So initially we're investing, right? And we're constantly investing, and SDI is an example of those kinds of investments. Let's test something out. But once it becomes accepted or proven, we can scale that out across the organization and across the sector, and it can actually be more cost efficient over time. We also, through some of these no wrong door approaches, start to address the idea of scale, right? Of meeting newcomers who are not accessing services, who may not want to do an intake with you, but need some information, right? It also is that notion of, again, those digital platforms, those digital communities where newcomers are in spaces, those 300 people in that group may never become clients, but they need information from you. So we need to be giving them that information. We need to be sharing that information. And then that has a network effect where they share it with a few other people. It's hard to track that sometimes, but we know that that happens. And we know that inserting good information into spaces where we may not be able to get the holy grail of the iCare statistic or iCare entry is still a valid client interaction. And that's a more difficult conversation we're having in the sector, but it's something that has to evolve because we know that newcomers are not always accessing formal services through an intake and needs assessment process, but they can still benefit from the information that we provide. So that's a different way of looking at effectiveness in our service delivery as well, is reaching people who may never become clients. And in that process, they may become clients. We saw this with an organization I worked with where we experimented with online ESL courses about 5 or 6 years ago. And 80% of the people who signed up for the courses were not existing clients of the organization because they couldn't access their ESL courses during the regular workday. They were accessing an online version of it because they had their survival jobs or family responsibilities and things like that. And some of those people were introduced to the other services of the organization and eventually became clients. So we also can look at it from those perspectives as well. But that does require a certain kind of indirect service delivery investment that our sector probably needs to increase, right? That's where the settlement.orgs and the outreach people and the marketing people and the digital navigator people. It's not necessarily about a client stat, but it's about creating a model for service delivery that reaches those people in those intangible ways.
Yeah, thank you. The next question is asking, what is your take on remote work and how online services impact the traditional work model?
So I'll answer the last one first. I think we've learned over the last 2 years that online services are possible, right? Like I said, some people would never have moved into digital service provision for another 5 or 7 years because they didn't think it was possible. They didn't think it was a good way to provide service. And certainly there's pros and cons, and we've learned that it's not for everyone. And that's never been the model for digital service delivery. It's always been this hybrid idea. You're going to have fully in-person clients, you're going to have some fully digital clients, and you're going to have most of your clients in between. And the notion that they're going to sometimes come and see you in person, sometimes online. And when I say to people, when people say that's impossible, I ask them, how many times do you email a client, phone a client, send client websites? We've been doing this for decades, right? It's not new. We've always had hybrid clients. We've just never really called it that. So online services impact the traditional work model in the sense that we can create more effective and efficient services for newcomers who want to be served in those ways. And what we've learned, we've known about it for many years, but we've certainly learned over the last 2 years is that that is possible with more newcomers than ever before. It also means, and I think this can impact the traditional work model, is that means perhaps spending more time with more vulnerable clients who need the in-person services. So if I can send you off on self-directed courses, if I can provide a suite of information online that you can work through on your own and interact with me asynchronously by email or digital messaging when you have questions, I'm still providing service to you. But you're not taking up a lot of my time necessarily, but maybe the client who needs more hand-holding can come and spend more time with me, which actually makes that service more accessible for both groups and more impactful for both of them as well. Because I'm self-directed, I just want you to guide me along and I'll take the next steps myself. You're helping them move along that process by giving them as much information as possible. And then you can serve people more effectively in person and have that kind of time. So my take on remote work is that it is an inevitable part of the model as we move forward, but it has to be tempered, like I said a couple questions ago, with what you understand of your audience. What's that split between in-person and hybrid and online clients? It may mean that some workers are doing more in-person work and some workers are doing more remote work, but there's going to be some sort of a split, and we need to be constantly evaluating it for how it can change over time. So tomorrow you might go into a 50-50 remote work in office model, and that may change as you evaluate service delivery models, newcomer preferences, out of office hour flexibility needs because of the people you're serving and things like that. So my take on remote work is that it's working for a lot of people. I've been in a lot of forums where I've heard from settlement workers who are like, I love not having a 2-hour commute in my day anymore. It means I can be more effective, more efficient, more awake, more alert, less angry about my commute when I get to work and when I get home. I'm able to balance actually my work life a lot easier because I don't have that time. Other people say I miss listening to podcasts on my way to work, but they take a walk in the morning now. So they're in fact more active. They've compensated for the elements of the commute that they enjoyed, and other people hate it, right? Other people want to be back in the office, and so I think our organizations have to work with those with those different mixes and figure out what works. But we do know that it works. We do know that it can work. And so it's also, I believe, here to stay.
Yeah. Thank you. The next question is asking, how can we use a digital platform to increase the participation and engagement of youth?
Yeah, that comes up a lot in forums. I hear in particular, everyone's surprised that the youth they serve haven't been more engaged in digital service delivery because youth are supposed to be digital natives and love digital and all these kinds of things. And so we're sort of exploding some of the myths of those kinds of, who are the digital natives, who prefers digital. So the first thing I always say to everybody is talk to your clients, right? That's the centering the newcomer and figuring out what works for them. What do they want to see in digital? How do they want to experience it? Does it need to be constantly synchronous like this, talking to each other in real time, like replicating the in-person experience where we're in a room at the same time? Or is it useful for them to have asynchronous pieces where they're doing self-work and things like that? Figuring out what works for your clients, figuring out what the platforms are that they prefer and how they want to be served. It also means in that digital skills framework, figuring out what our online facilitation and engagement skill set needs to be, because it's different than when we're in person, right? It's figuring out how to be engaging. So many of our presentations, our Zoom meetings are, I'm showing a PowerPoint and I'm boring my audience to tears, right? Like I may have done with some of you in my PowerPoint. If we're doing service delivery, we want to build in interaction. We want to build in engagement and tools. And there's tons of those kinds of tools that exist where you can build in, online post-it noting, bring in Padlets, Kahoot, Mentimeter, these gamification tools and things like that. But we need to know about these tools. We need to become users of those tools, but we also need to figure out what are some of the tools that work for the youth that we're serving. So I'll give you a good example. Early in the pandemic, someone I know had planned a full day workshop with the youth that they were working with, and they had to pivot online. So the first thing they did is that they broke that into 2 half days, because one full day online is exhausting, let's be honest. Then they spoke to the youth that they were working with about the tools that they are using, because they wanted to use video, they wanted to do whiteboarding, they wanted to do activities that they did in their own time during the half day. So, on Google Docs and things like that, as it turned out. And the youth were like, yeah, we use Discord. So Discord was unfamiliar to that person, but it had all of those elements. It's basically Zoom for gamers, right? But it's now become a more mainstream tool. So they figured out what the platform was that the youth they worked with were comfortable with, already knew, and in fact could take the lead in some aspects and teach that person about some of those tools. That also really increased the engagement, because the youth took the lead in creating the experience for that project in some ways. And then they came to use the platform. They split it over a couple of days, and it was effective and it worked in the end. So that conversation is constantly important. We need to be open to the platforms that we may not be familiar with, and then become proficient in them. That also takes time, but it certainly is possible. And then again, the skills of online facilitation and online engagement. And over the last 2 years, once again, we've seen huge audiences and communities build, practice and models and ideas about how to move some of the facilitation techniques that they may have used offline into an online space. So we can point you to those because they're really useful. But that's an area that our sector, I find, is still struggling with, is how to make online more engaging.
Yeah, absolutely. Working with youth is a pleasure, but can be challenging to find out which ways are the best.
Yes, but so the first thing I always say is just ask them.
Yeah,
start there. You might be surprised.
Great point. Okay, we'll go for one last question. So partnerships with,
we
already
did
did
this one
this.
already.
Yes. Yeah. What should we as SPOs stop and start doing right now in order to address the challenges?
Oh, wow. So the first thing is my call to action at the end, is to start reflecting and sharing what you're learning and what your challenges are. So we need to identify some of those things. Let me go back to my challenges on my screen here, just so I remember all the things that I said. So the first is around the remote work life. So again, is making sure that remote work conversation is not just about technical and service, but is also about wellness, right? There's been a large research and a lot of data and our own experiences that look at wellness when it comes to working digitally, and what that means for how we take breaks, how we feel isolated when we're working from home. So the remote work, as we move back from purely at home and remote into a more hybrid model, that'll help because we'll have those in-person challenges. But we also know that there's been some really interesting power dynamics during the pivot to digital that have had a positive impact. Myself and North York Community House and the Department of Imaginary Affairs did a survey in March 2020 that asked people immediately after the pivot what their experience was like. And some of the things we heard from people were the person who dominated the meetings in person hasn't figured out how to dominate them digitally yet. So I feel like I can contribute more. I feel we've democratized our team's conversations and things like that. That's a massive spike in actual wellness where that person doesn't feel intimidated anymore. And that was because of the digital shift. We need to figure out those toxic kind of relationships in our own organizations, but also make sure that what we do remotely is dealt with, right? So we need to figure out what's working in our relationships within our organizations and our power dynamics and things like that. We need to figure out, let's see. Yeah, so the biggest thing is I think we need to start sharing. We need to start having the conversation about what's working, and we need to start building in time for learning and reflection. And I know that I've heard from a lot of people that they're professional developmented out. They're tired of the constant learning, but that's where we're at. We are on a steep learning curve right now and have been for the last 2 years. So we need to figure out how to decide what our priorities in the organization are. Right? So what's the suite of technology tools that we're going to use? Now, everybody needs to become an expert in those tools, not just from a technology perspective, but from a facilitation perspective, right? So for example, if you're using WhatsApp, switch to WhatsApp Business because you can put in auto replies. You can put in out of office hour messages, just like you would with your email, for example, which builds in some of the challenges related to boundaries and addresses some of those things. So tools themselves, but then how do you use WhatsApp effectively, right? Audio messaging, video messaging, become a power user, become a Zoom power user if that's the way you're going, or a Teams power user. So figuring out these are the suite of tools that we are going to use today. That may change over time, but today our organization's using these. Make sure everyone that's onboarded becomes proficient in those tools. Make sure that everyone in the organization is oriented and becomes proficient and a power user in those tools. Everyone needs to understand privacy, security, and confidentiality in the digital context. There needs to be policies, checklists, training, all of those things that have to happen. So those are the kinds of things that service providers can start now. Management needs this in a different way as frontline workers do. We also need that conversation to go both ways. So the tools that frontline workers are using or want to use, there needs to be a way to have a good conversation with managers to say, I need to use WhatsApp with my clients. Here's why, here's how I'm going to use it, and here's how you can manage me in using that, for example. And managers have to become less afraid of technology and less apt to say no to a technology decision and figure out how to manage in this environment as well. So I think we've learned a lot about those challenges over the last 2 years, but there's certainly work that can be done. Those of you who have started figuring it out and started creating some of these policies, so for example, even back in 2017, the Build On program had created a one-pager for clients that said, these are the tools we're going to use to communicate with you. It was WhatsApp, Skype, email, Viber, and here are our assessments of their privacy and security, right? So they actually gave it a 5 out of 5 star rating and said, when it's personal information, we'll use this, this, and this, as well as the portal. That's really useful because both the worker understands the tools that are going to be used and when to use what tools, and so does the newcomer and client themselves. And so you build that into the everyday practice and figure out what tools to use when, to have pathways to flow from a non-secure to a secure environment. So for example, if something happens in your Facebook page and you want to bring it into a private chat, move them into WhatsApp, move them into your phone, move them into another tool, for example. But understanding how to do that, having the policies in place to have those pathways is also something that's really important. So that privacy pathway and security pathway, when I've shared the PDF that I think will go out of my slides, and a lot of those images have links to further information. So making those decision trees within our organization is something that SPOs can start to do now.
Yeah, that's very helpful information too. Okay, so we have come to the end of our Q&A. unfortunately. Apologies for the questions we didn't get to answer. But
if you want, feel free to send them to me, and I'm happy to send some replies as well that can be posted into the portal.
Perfect. So thank you once again, Marco, for sharing with us digitalization in this age and in the sector that we work in. The session has officially ended, and we look forward to having you in our next session, which starts at 2:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And for now, please enjoy your break and check out our wellness videos if you will. And thank you, everyone. Thank you, Marco.
Thanks for having me. This was great.